you in a nutshell. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much. I will be presenting work done mainly by my colleague, Ruud Ruben, and myself on living income, presenting several cases from sub-Saharan Africa. And I actually start with a question, so please raise your hands if you know what a living income is or a living wage. People who know what a living income is, living wage. So it's 1/3 of the group, maybe 1/4. The people online, you can put it in the chat if you like, so we can count sort of the knowledge level on living income. The reason I ask is it's rather specific, so that's why I will be presenting what a living income is as well, starting with that. To be very short, it's the amount of money needed to have a decent standard of living, to be able to afford a decent standard of living, and I will dive into that later. Next slide, please. So I will hear later from the people managing the chat whether there's anyone who knows the living income concept online also. So this is what we've done. We look at the living income concept, living income benchmarks for a range of studies in sub-Saharan Africa. We look at different pathways to close the living income gap, basically to see how farmers could be and households could be earning more specifically. And we look shortly at the implications of the discussions on livelihoods and gender, for instance. So the key research questions were: how far do current production models and trade conditions enable farmers and their families to earn a living income? And what could be opportunities to close the living income gaps? And that's a very specific question for me always in the work. So what is the potential for households to actually earn much more than they currently do? Next slide, please. So this is the visual of the living income story, as it's called by the Living Income Community of Practice. They've developed this based on the living wage concept, which has been, well, going on for ages by ILO. And basically it means that there's a certain standard of living, a living income benchmark, which allows for a decent standard of living, which is based on a low-cost model diet, for instance, a decent house. People should be able to send their children to school. They should be able to afford healthcare. And then there's transport and unforeseen events, basically. So based on these conditions, a living income benchmark is established, which is ranges between sort of $3,000 per year and I would say $8,000 or $9,000 a year. Specifically. And if you have the benchmark, you can actually calculate what a family earns and deduct that from the benchmark, and you end up with a living income gap, as you can see here. Interestingly, the living income gap for typical families is thousands of dollars per year, right? So a lot of people underestimate the size of the living income gap. And basically, so the question is, how can we increase household incomes with $3,000 to $4,000 per year, which is a sizable amount, right? People have to earn twice or 3 times as much to meet the benchmark generally. Next slide, please. So this is what we did. We did based on the studies, the available studies. The interesting first lesson was already is that the value chain reports generally focus on only one crop, basically, which is very intensive and very informative. But a living income concept is basically a household concept. So you have to look at all the aspects that that add up to a total household income. And we had to do some assumptions based on the available data on the income from the different crops produced. You calculate the living income the gap based on looking at actual income and the living income benchmark. And then we look at the 4 different strategies to close the living income gaps and how successful they would be or what their potential would be. Next slide, please. So basically what we see on average is people generally earn half of the living income benchmark, what they should be earning, right? So if the living income benchmark is $6,500 in Côte d'Ivoire, the typical family earns half of that amount. We do see large inequalities between the households because there are some farmers and households actually earning a living income, and there's also a large group of farmers being very far from earning a living income, right? So we do, so also what the relevant strategies are rather differ per farmer or household segments. And these statistics you see here is the equivalence of the living income gap for the commodity produced or the product produced. That's a very technical story. I won't be diving into that. But basically, households are earning very little compared to the living income benchmark. I think that's the key conclusion here. Next slide, please. Then we did some statistics to look at the sort of the correlation between the living income benchmark and, for instance, GDP growth, poverty rates, and education levels. And I won't dive into it in here because you can read the paper, but there's some very interesting trends we found throughout the country studies. Next slide, please. And here it becomes interesting, at least for me. This is the key thing, what I'm really interested in. So if we have the current situation, what would need to change for households to actually be able to earn a living income? And the next question then is sort of how can we actually get the change to happen? So if you look at 4 examples here from maize in Nigeria, green beans in Kenya, cocoa from Cameroon, and groundnut production in Ghana, you see the amount of change that would need to occur in income levels to meet the living income benchmark. So for instance, it's a bit small. Generally, there needs to be a duplication of prices, for instance, to meet the living income benchmark, basically. Also, in terms of land, if you look at green beans, basically there needs to be a 400% increase on average for a typical family to be able to earn a living income, right? So there's quite some constraints happening. Specifically in Cameroon, there's a lot happening in terms of yield and land constraints, but also price constraints, right, from our models. So you see different constraints happening. And one of the interesting aspects is looking at off-farm employment, and that there's a link to the discussion previously when looking at employment possibilities within agriculture. But basically, we also look beyond agriculture, right? So if you would be working somewhere else, how much would you earn, and would that close the living income gap? So next slide, please. Now we dive into the 4 strategies we analyze in terms of the potential to increase income significantly, right, in absolute levels. And you see that fragmentation is ongoing in Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, that's what a lot of people know, but also that commercially oriented systems have more land constraints than others. And there's definitely, the land constraints are across the board. We see it everywhere. Fragmentation leading to challenges in terms of the potential to earn a living income. Next slide, please. Then we look at the yield gaps. So there's a lot of programs in a lot of sectors focusing on actually increasing yields and closing the gaps. And as you can see from a technical perspective, a lot is possible. Well, I've been in sort of agricultural production systems for almost 20 years. And in some sectors, we see very little change, even though millions have been invested, right? So across the board, there's a small group of farmers improving a lot, but there's a large group of farmers still sort of not improving the yields as we would expect them. And a lot of the reasons we find is people don't have the time, they don't have the money, there's investment challenges, specifically for the half of the farmers that are basically poorest. They're pretty stuck in sort of not being able to increase yields and volumes. So there's a challenge in that sense. So the technical potential is there, but the sort of the economic, the social, the behavioral, the enabling factors are rather constraining. Then we go to the next slide, please. Price is a discussion which happens a lot. What we did based on the value chain studies is look at the differences between small scale, mid-size and large farmers and the prices they receive. So basically the smallest farmers actually receive the lowest prices, which is interesting in itself. And there's a large discussion ongoing about price increases, how farm gate prices could increase, what could be the role of the government to reduce taxes, for instance, even in the Netherlands, right? So we're having the same discussions, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa, and whether companies importing raw materials could also increase the price. So there's, I think, a lot still ongoing. And what we see is sort of even a 10% price increase is already a challenge often for many companies, right? Let alone doubling the price. So that's something to take into account still. Next slide, please.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And then employment creation. So what we look at is, because it's a household concept, living income, and you look at all the sources of income that a household can get, it's also very valuable to look at sort of the income employment opportunities. So working off farm, doing other things than farming, either besides farming or moving out of farming altogether. And interesting, we see challenges with wage rates, right? If you look at current wage rates and you would like to earn a living income, you basically need a full-time employment of 2 people in the household to meet the living income conditions. But obviously people, well, so whole households with families, there's a bit of a challenge there, right? So even if you would go and be employed somewhere else, you still wouldn't meet the living income definition, benchmark definition. Next slide, please. So, well, there's some implications for policy strategies for all the 4 of the pathways. I think we can move to the next slide, so we stay within time. So implications for policy and research. Well, the first, which I didn't note down here, is if you collect data, please look at the household concept, the household income, because and not focus only on a certain crop or commodity, because that's a pity, because you miss out a lot of the information. The second is to look at the potential for income improvement from the literature perspective, but also from a cost-benefit perspective. Because it could be that one of the measures costs a lot of money, has very limited effectiveness, while another measure could be more cost effective, right? So it's very important to do that. And what we see is that yield and price increase options do not or cannot close living income gaps entirely, as is often assumed. And specifically for the poorest households, something is happening. Specifically for the poorest households, because basically they earn very little. They have a very small volume, so even a doubling of the prices would lead to sort of marginal absolute income increases. And the same for yield. So we see a lot of targets on 20% yield increase or 30% yield increase or doubling of price. But if you produce 500 kilogram per year or 1000 kilogram, the question is how much in absolute terms that would make a difference. So it's very important, what we realize, is to look at employment options within the agricultural sector, but also specifically beyond, as a way to look at to increase incomes, and that's a very challenging one, right? Then there is a gender wage gap, because what we see is the most vulnerable households who are the poorest are women, basically. So that's something that needs to be addressed, and I think my colleagues and yesterday and today said the same. And that still people talk about it, but the implementation is rather challenging, right? And then commercial crops, people producing commercial crops are better able to reduce nutritional deficiencies and improve labor productivity. And there could be sense of long-term delivering contracts and collective action. So thank you very much.